Industrial Revolution started in the mid-18th century in England. It gave rise to the capitalist mode of production based on salaried work on the factory as a production unit and on free competition between companies in the market. This was the period of competitive capitalism. Over the next 100 years, technological innovations continued to emerge. In the mid-19th century, there was a profound impact on the economy and industrial production. In this, the Second Industrial Revolution impacted several areas. For example, in 1856, England perfected the steel production process, which replaced iron in civil construction and began to be used also in construction of railways and ships, in addition to the manufacture of armaments. In 1859, in the Pennsylvania region, east coast of the United States, oil was discovered, which began to be industrially explored and used for various purposes. In 1879, the electric lamp was invented, which radically changed many of the population's habits when its use became widespread in ambient lighting. With the new technological changes, the concentration of capital, with the formation of increasingly larger companies that absorbed the smaller ones and monopolized entire branches of production, eliminated competition. At the same time, large banks were formed, which linked their financial capital to industrial capital. The dominant economic system ceased to be competitive capitalism. In its place, the economy of nations with large industrial production took the form of monopoly capitalism. The Second Industrial Revolution also had an impact on social life and in the mentality of the people of the time. For many, there was a sense of infinity of human creative capacity, which brought the conviction that these inventions would build an even better world. Therefore, the period between the second half of the 19th century and the first years of the 20th century was known as the Bell Epoch. The area of transport, for example, was one of the most transformed at the time. In a few decades, the bicycle, the subway, the electric locomotive, and the automobile were invented. Large railways were also built, such as the Transcontinental and the Trans-Siberian. At the turn of the century, the experiments of the American brothers Orville and Wilbur Wright in the United States and the Brazilian Alberto Santos Dumont in Paris culminated in the invention of the plane. In the area of communications, we can highlight the invention of the telephone, the phonograph, the wireless telegraph, and the cinema, invented by the French brothers Auguste and Louis Lumière. Radio, which emerged in the first decades of the 20th century, and cinema would pave the way for mass leisure as we know it in modern society, accessible to most social classes. The industry has also undergone transformations. At the beginning of the 20th century, the assembly line was created at the Ford car factory in the United States. With it came the Ford series production, which led to an extraordinary increase in productivity and a decrease in the price of products. At the same time, new forms of payment were created, such as sales to credit, and the first large department stores appeared. Important discoveries have also taken place in the areas of medical and health care. The bacteriologists Robert Koch from Germany and Louis Pasteur from France, for example, discovered that diseases were caused by microscopic infectious agents such as bacteria. Until 1890, several scientists had already identified the agents of several diseases, tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid, and tetanus among others, and had been developing vaccines to fight them. These new treatments have contributed to reducing the high number of deaths caused by them. In addition, the finding that the use of antiseptics, for example, was essential to prevent post-operative infections significantly reduced the rate of mortality from surgical interventions. The discovery of anesthetics has enabled physicians not only to relieve their patients' pain, but also the performance of longer surgeries, which were unfeasible until then. To absorb the increase in the productive capacity of the industries, mainly in the United States and Europe, it was necessary to increase the number of consumers for goods and products, in addition to expanding the sources of raw materials, coal, iron, oil. With the process of capital concentration, large companies and banks then started to make investments in regions of Africa, Asia, and of Latin America, with the support of its national states, associating military forces to economic power, which strengthened control over these territories. The European powers had a great geopolitical interest in the formation of colonial empires. If there was a war, it would be a way to guarantee the possession of resources such as coal, mines, rivers, men for their armies, and the control of ports where they could supply merchant ships and warships. Thus emerged a new type of imperialism. In Africa and Asia, this imperialist policy took the form of neocolonialism, with the conquest of vast territories through military action. Many of these territories were transformed into colonies or protectorates. This process was very quick. Around 1800, before expansion, European countries and the United States controlled 35% of the Earth's surface. By 1878, it was 67. In 1914, when the First World War started, it was already around 84%. With the exception of Ethiopia, Liberia, and part of Morocco, at the end of the 19th century, the African continent was divided between England, Germany, France, Belgium, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. Angola and Mozambique were colonies of Portugal since the 16th century, and Algeria was under French control since 1857. In Asia and the islands of the Pacific, in addition to the British, the French, Germans, and Dutch, there was also the colonialist domination of the United States and Japan. Governments and dominant groups in Europe, when instigated to justify military or just occupation actions, used the argument of a supposed civilizing mission by which Europeans should lead the so-called primitive or barbarian peoples and show them the values of Western and Christian civilization. From a cultural point of view, this process resulted in the destruction of traditions and ancient values of Africans, Asians, and their replacement with European values. The action of Catholic and Protestant missionaries caused the disruption of the religious beliefs of many societies on the two subjugated continents, converting them to Christianity. The partition of Africa in the 19th century began in 1876 when the Belgians, ruled by King Leopold II, settled in the Congo River basin, a vast region rich in minerals, and subjugated the population to the rule of Belgium. From then onwards, a race began between European nations interested in conquering a piece of the African continent. To solve the problems arising from this dispute, between 1884 and 1885, there was the Berlin Conference, where the rules were decided for the sharing of Africa among European nations. In less than 2 decades, many borders were established to meet the needs of imperialist countries, regardless of ethnic divisions and cultural aspects of the Africans. In this way, people who originally lived in ethnic and cultural conflict were grouped in the same territory, so conversely, groups that shared geographical space harmoniously were separated. This situation would have repercussions in later terrible ethnic conflicts, for example between Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, which took place in 1994. African resistance to European colonization was intense, and this generated wars in different regions. Despite this, the Africans were supplanted by the military and technological superiority of the colonizers, who had cannons and machine guns. Only in the second half of the 20th century would African countries begin to regain their independence. Some regions, such as Angola and Mozambique, remained as a colony until the 1970s. During the period of commercial expansion in Europe, which began in the 15th century, foreign interference in Asia was restricted to the installation of factories in India and China. Exceptions to this rule were the colonized islands by the Dutch from the 17th century. This situation changed with the Industrial Revolution, when European industrialized nations began to conquer more territories. In 1599, when the East India Company was created in England, the British established regular trade with India and other countries from Southeast Asia and set up trading posts in several cities in the Indian subcontinent. Over time, the Indian territory was placed in the area of influence of the English and later annexed to England. In the early 19th century, the country was made a protectorate of England. British presence affected Indian culture, customs, and economy, which added to political oppression. This fueled hatred of the English in the Indian population. In 1857, the accumulated dissatisfaction erupted in the Sepoy Mutiny, the name by which the Indian soldiers, promoters of the uprising, were known. The rebellion spread across northern India and was only contained 2 years later. In 1876, Indian territory was officially incorporated into the British Empire. Until the beginning of the 19th century, only 2 ports in China were open to international trade. In 1839, the Chinese government ordered the destruction of shipments of opium, which was smuggled smuggled by English merchants on boats from the British flag. England, alleging violation of the Free Trade Pact, declared war on China. It was the beginning of the Opium War. The war was won by the British, and China had to open its ports to British products and deliver to England the island of Hong Kong, which would only be returned to China in 1997. China later became involved in an armed conflict against Japan between 1894 and 1895. Once again defeated, it was divided into areas administered by England, Germany, France, Russia, and Japan. In order to resist the domination of the international powers, the members of a nationalist secret society, the Boxers, carried out several attacks against foreigners in Chinese territory. In retaliation, troops formed by English, German, French, Russian, Japanese, and Americans attacked China, triggering the Boxer War in 1900. Defeated more than once, the Chinese had to make new concessions to the imperialist powers. In 1911, the Chinese Nationalist Party proclaimed the Republic, putting an end to foreign domination. Like China, Japan was, in the beginning of the 19th century, close to international trade, going against the interests of industrialized countries, especially the United States. In 1854, under threat from the cannons of 8 U.S. warships anchored off the coast, the Japanese government was forced to open trade negotiations with the United States. Shortly after, countries like Holland, France, England, and Russia also signed similar agreements with the Japanese. In 1868, after a civil war, Emperor Mutsuhito assumed power in Japan, beginning the Meiji era. Deciding to modernize the country, he abolished the old semi-feudal system that was still in force in Japan, promulgated a constitution, instituted a parliament with 2 chambers, simulated the establishment of factories and the construction of railways, and adopted the European calendar. Following the European model, Japan also had imperialist pretensions. After conquering some regions of the Pacific, in 1894, the country declared war on China to seize the Manchuria region between 1904 and 1905 and defeated the Russians, who disputed the same territory. In this, Japan had become a new world power.